Hello. I am delighted to be here. My name is Jim Levitt. I am the director of the International Land Conservation Network at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I'm delighted to introduce this webinar on implementing conservation easements, barriers, and opportunities in Europe. I will simply introduce my colleague Tilman Disselhoff, who has been working with the ILCN, the International Land Conservation Network, since before it was formally created, and is a highly esteemed colleague of mine. It's a pleasure to work with him. Tilman, congratulations on pulling this together and all of your work at Eurosite and the ELCN. I hand the microphone to you.
Thanks so much, Jim, for the kind introduction today. I'm your moderator of this webinar today. And if you're wondering why I'm the moderator, that's because I have been part of a LIFE project, a EU-funded project called European Networks for Private Land Conservation. And as part of this project, me representing NABU, the Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union of Germany, we have done a number of actions on conservation easements, among which a international workshop in Berlin hosted by NABU in cooperation with Eurosite, the European Land Conservation Network. So the first part of this webinar today will be a retrospection of the findings of that international workshop on conservation easements in Berlin. My dear colleague Carolina Halevi of Eurosite will present these findings, and in the second half of the webinar, we will have a panel discussions, and I'm delighted that we will be joined by 5 international experts from various European countries to tell you a bit more about where we are with regard to the use of conservation easements in Europe. So that's the overall plan for the next hour or so. We'll kick it off with Carolina's presentation. Carolina is the project coordinator of the LIFE project that I just mentioned. She has been working for Eurosite for a couple of years, which is an umbrella organization, I should say, of European conservation practitioners and site managers, and they also coordinate this project. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Carolina, and take it away.
Thank you, Tilman, and good day to everyone. I'm happy to set the stage for today's webinar. Tilman already mentioned we will be talking about barriers and opportunities of implementing conservation easements in Europe, and what I will be presenting to you is based on the work we have done as the LIFE ENPLC project, as well as the workshop that we held earlier this year. So next slide, please. So I would like to start off with a short crash course. What are conservation easements? I'm not sure if every one of the participants is aware of it. Maybe we can also give a quick poll in the chat to see if there's anyone in here who doesn't know what conservation easements are. Next slide, please. So let's take a step back. What does owning land mean? If you think about land ownership, you can visualize it as a bundle of sticks, and each stick represents a certain right that you have as a landowner. At the same time, being a landowner comes also with a set of responsibilities, for example, paying taxes. Plus, there are also binding laws which landowners do not have a choice to ignore, for example, on environmental protection, building codes, and so on. You can also think of private land conservation as a legal mechanism that can be used to stimulate land use change. It is complementary to what is legally required, and it expands our toolbox and doesn't replace anything. So next slide, please. There are many ways as to how private land conservation can be implemented. Most are underpinned by some form of contractual agreement, and today we will look at conservation easements as one of such conservation tools. Going back to the stick metaphor, conservation easement basically means that landowners voluntarily give up additional sticks or rights and transfer these to a so-called easement holder. And that's usually a public authority or a qualified conservation organization. In the US, these are the so-called land trusts. The characteristics of conservation easements that make them so attractive to a broad range of stakeholders are that they run with the land and they become part of the property title. So they're not bound to a specific landowner. These agreements are ideal for long-term nature conservation, as they usually last in perpetuity or for something like 99 years. They're also very flexible and can be adapted to a broad set of use cases. They also allow for economic activities as long as they're compatible with the nature protection targets. And ideally, they're connected to some sort of financial compensation to incentivize landowners to adopt this tool. Next slide, please. So next, I would like to share some anecdotes with you about conservation easement from across the world. Next slide. To be more specific, I will share with you some insights from the US and New Zealand or Australia. And if you would like to do some more research yourself, it is worthwhile to have a look as well at South Africa, Canada, and developments that are ongoing in some South American countries, if you want to learn more about conservation easements across the globe. Next slide, please. So conservation easements are well established in the US, and as of 2023, the National Conservation Database reports approximately 33.5 million acres of land that were protected by conservation easements. The great breakthrough for conservation easements came in 1981, and that was around the time that the Uniform Conservation Act and reforms of the Federal Tax Code came into place. The Uniform Conservation Act served as a template for state legislation to codify the use of easements for conservation purposes, and the reform of the Federal Tax Code allowed landowners to treat donations of conservation easements as charitable in-kind donations, and to deduct these from their income taxes then. Also, in 1981, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which is hosting the ILCN, which is also hosting this webinar today, hosted the first gathering of land trusts from across the US, and that led to the establishment of the Land Trust Alliance. Land trusts are those organizations, as I mentioned before, in the US that hold conservation easements. And as of 2023, they have about 2,200 land trusts that protect about 20.2 million acres of conservation easements. So that's about 2/3 of all conservation easements. And yeah, in the image you see that there's really clear kind of uptake in around that area, and these three events happened at the same time. So yeah, there might be some connection there. Next slide, please. So beyond financial incentives, what motivates landowners to protect land is recognition from their peers. I'm probably going to say this word incorrectly, but Hayatiaki is a Maori expression, and it means guardians of the land that they would hand over to the next generations. So landowners often think in generations. They see the land as their capital, and they want to give it to the next generations in a better state. And conservation easements can provide also some guarantee for landowners that their efforts are safeguarded and the natural values of the land stays protected. And in the image, you can see something that you might consider the Oscars for farmers, which is something that happens in New Zealand and Australia to give basically these pioneering landowners recognition for the work that they do. Next slide, please. So moving over to Europe now, I would like to share with you some learnings from implementations that we had across Europe working with easements, as well as some statuses as where we are standing. Okay, next slide, please. Starting off with something that I will probably also mispronounce, Obligation Réelle Environnementale. So we will shortly just call them OREs. They were created in 2016 as part of the renewed French Environmental Code. OREs are one of the closest tools in the EU that are to what is understood as a conservation easement in the US, with one of the main difference that it doesn't last in perpetuity, but for 99 years. And that is due to legal limitations in France. Since 2016, over 50 OREs have been concluded, and their size ranges from 0.3 hectares to a couple hundred hectares. And the French Ministry for the Environment is also currently in the process to set up a database to make sure we can keep an overview of these OREs. Something to note is that there are only few financial advantages currently to putting an ORE on your property. The way that it's set up is quite complex, and they're perceived as not sufficient enough to motivate landowners just from a financial perspective to implement an easement on their land. There are, however, some other players that are, for example, developers or water authorities who are moving forward with connecting easements to payments, as they're, for example, interested in carbon offsetting. And interestingly, the Environmental Code explicitly mentions OREs to be used for such purposes. And in the blue square, you can see some numbers from the OREs that the Conservatoire d'Espace Naturel has implemented. And we also have one of our panelists from that organization if you have any questions. Next slide, please. So conservation covenants, they're called in the UK, or in England, I should say, were proposed for England in 2014 by the Law Commission. And the legislative process for them was adopted in 2022, and the implementation has started in 2023. However, no agreement has been signed yet. Again, general criteria are very close to the US conservation easements, and with one of the main difference that the easements holder, the party, as I mentioned before, that signs the conservation easements, is or has to be a responsible body which has been appointed by the State Secretary of the Environment. And we also have a panelist from Natural England joining us who would maybe want to mention a couple of things about that later as well in the discussion. What's interesting about the setup of the agreements in the UK is that it can include ancillary obligations, which, for example, guarantee the money to cover maintenance costs in the long term. So although there currently has not been any agreement signed just yet, there is a great demand from the landowners for this tool, and farmers are already approaching Natural England, which is one of the potential easement holders, to ask if they can implement an easement on their land. Next slide, please. So as part of the LIFE ENPLC project, we have implemented 10 case studies in 5 EU countries. And out of all of these case studies, we had successful implementations in Germany, Belgium, Spain, the Czech Republic, and Sweden. And throughout these implementations, we came across a couple of common barriers. And what really stood out that, well, there's uncertainties about or unawareness about the potential of the tool. And there's also still some hesitation because of the long time frame that they usually set up for. And in the case where we had something that the long time frame seemed to be a barrier, we used a combination of conservation tools. So we used a stewardship agreement, which is basically a short-term management contract that could then be bridged over in a conservation easement in the Catalan case study. And one of the main barriers that has been identified in our case studies was that lacking or rather low financial incentives to implement such a tool. Something that stood out was that it's really essential to build trust and relationships to overcome these barriers with landowners, and to be very transparent about the process, to clearly communicate, and also patience. You do need patience. So as a final conclusion, we are really in the early stage of adopting conservation easements in Europe. And to do so, we need to work with the landowners that maybe identify as so-called early adopters, which are those that are willing to trial out new concepts, basically the risk takers and trendsetters amongst the landowners. Next slide, please. So finally, I quickly want to touch upon several points that should be considered when trying to upscale conservation easement in Europe. Next slide, please. First, I would like to mention some legal challenges. So current approaches in the EU are to either use existing property rights and to apply them to conservation purposes, or to introduce new legal instruments. Both approaches have their advantages and disadvantages. The private law instruments that already exist in the European national legal system often require a dominant property, or they prohibit the use of positive obligations. Using them for conservation purposes is therefore only possible to a limited extent, and might even require a combination of different legal instruments, which can then become very complex and could be very difficult to handle in practice. The introduction of new property law, on the other hand, is usually a very lengthy legislative process. So that's also something to keep in mind. Moreover, to ensuring the practical success of new legal instruments, they might also require additional laws that are outside of the property realm. Then let's talk about incentives. So incentives for businesses and, well, landowners. So a survey by the LIFE project, which is the predecessor project of the LIFE ENPLC project, showed that landowners prefer incentives that come in the form of tax benefits, and they would also choose annual payments if they could. And conservation easement could also provide a way forward for landowners who are wishing to supply ecosystem services and thus secure green finances. That point is also relevant for when we talk about businesses, and conservation easements are interesting for business actors because they provide some level of security when investing in voluntary nature conservation. And on the other side, if conservation easements are connected to financial incentives, then that also directly attracts companies to go above and beyond what is legally required of them. And finally, the perception of conservation easement greatly depends also on the image of the easement holders. So for that reason, in the US, the Land Trust Alliance has established 12 standards and practices on key topics to assure a high level quality and integrity of the land trust. And their accreditation program is basically set up to assure and reassure regulators and the public on the legitimacy of the easements themselves. So conservation easements, their legal framework, implementation and enforcement are done on a country level in the EU, and they also need to fit the local needs, and they need to fit within legal frameworks that exist in those countries already. So there are, however, some things that could be done on an EU level, and these activities include knowledge exchange, something that we're currently doing, potential harmonization, networking, communication, and advocacy work. That's something that the Land Trust Alliance does in the US, and it is a potential role for the Conservation Landowners Coalition, which is a partnership between ELO, the European Landowners Organization, and Eurosite, that is one of the outcomes of the LIFE ENPLC project. So what I presented to you today is really a condensed summary of the workshop and the work that we've done. So I would like to also invite you to read the reports that we wrote about it, and you're also very welcome to reach out to us if you have any more questions. And that is it. I'm handing over again to my colleague Tilman for the second half.
Thank you so much, Carolina. That was a lot of information in a short period of time, little more than 15 minutes. I'm sure that those who've listened to this have a number of questions, and as a matter of fact, there are already questions trickling in through the chat and also the Q&A. I forgot to say, please use the Q&A button if you want to ask questions. That makes it easier for me as the moderator to monitor those questions and to ask them to our panelists who are already turning on their screens. Very well done. We have an esteemed round of experts on conservation easements from various European countries, as I already said. I'm shortly going to introduce them to you so you know who's on the screen now, and then we'll kick it off with the Q&A and the panel discussion. So starting for me at the bottom of my screen, I don't know if it's the same for you, there's Graham Kerr of Natural England. And Graham has been in charge of the file of conservation covenants for Natural England, which is the advisory body to the Ministry for the Environment in England. If I'm not mistaken, Graham, for quite some time. But the issue has gained considerable momentum over the last 2 years or so, precisely because of what Carolina said, the legal, let's say, a framework that was constructed of net biodiversity gain, and the provisions related to conservation covenants in that context. So that's Graham. Then going clockwise on my screen, I'm seeing Katharina Prater, who's also partially based in England, at least, but she comes from Portugal originally, as you can see from her name. She works for a charity called the LifeScape Project. She's a lawyer by training, and she's managing the rewilding law project for the LifeScape Project, which looks into legal tools for rewilding in various European countries. And one of these tools obviously also could be conservation easements. Then I have Renaud Delage from the, he has introduced himself in the Q&A already, from the Federation of Nature Conservancies in France. So it's a bit like the sister organization of the Land Trust Alliance in the United States. So he works on the federal level. He oversees the development of these obligations réelles environnementales, OREs, the French equivalent to conservation easements. And he advises the member organizations, I suppose, under the federation in the use of that tool. Then we have Tom Cabeu from Natuurpunt in Belgium, the Flemish BirdLife partner and also a member of Eurosite. Tom has a degree in environmental sciences and biology, so he's a conservation practitioner by training and by heart. He's been implementing the Flemish, let's say, version of conservation easements in the context of voluntary private land conservation in Flanders, so together with private landowners. So he has a very practical view on the matter. Then we have Johanna Singer of the University of Würzburg, who has studied in Würzburg and also in Wales, in a place that I'm probably going to mispronounce now, Aberystwyth. Yeah, more or less. It's Welsh. And she's currently writing her PhD in conservation easements, analyzing whether German property law can be used for that purpose. So that's our esteemed group of panelists. And my first question would go to Graham. We heard already about the conservation covenants, the state of play. What's the news? Since what has happened since our last workshop on conservation easements in June in Berlin?
Okay, thank you, Tillman. As Carolina was saying, we have the legal framework in place. That was the Environment Act, which came in 2021, and conservation covenants were included within that. The bit that was missing was that it hadn't been taken forward and there hadn't been any responsible bodies appointed. So since June, organisations from the end of July have been able to apply to our Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to become responsible bodies. Natural England has submitted an application. We're aware that some other organisations have. Our department has said it will probably take about 12 weeks to consider the applications. We submitted ours in November, so we would expect to hear sometime in the new year hopefully sort of the early part. Once that happens, you have the landowners who were already aware that landowners are approaching organisations saying, can I have a conservation covenant? And there will be responsible bodies who are actually able to negotiate the conservation covenant with them. So sometime next year, we should have our first conservation covenants. If you want me to say anything more about what we might be using them for, I can either do so now or later on.
All right. So no conservation covenants under the biodiversity net gain law yet, but very likely to come next year. All right.
It's not a biodiversity net gain law. Conservation covenants are much bigger than that. Biodiversity net gain was included within the Environment Act, and it is thought that conservation covenants could be useful for delivering that. It's very separate.
Okay, so one is the purpose and the other one is the tool, if I understand you correctly.
And there are lots of other purposes that conservation covenants could be used for.
Okay, got it. So you'll keep us updated about the signature of the first conservation covenant. Are there any plans already? Have you heard of any potential applications, first cases?
Well, we are being approached by landowners at the moment. They tend to be altruistic landowners who have possibly had agri-environment agreements, and they want to preserve those for, let's say, their posterity, leave a legacy.
Okay, so there's a level of interest.
So that's one level of interest. The other things that we're considering, now Natural England is only going to take on a limited number of conservation covenants initially, so we can test our processes for actually delivering them. But we will have something called a credit scheme, which is linked to biodiversity net gain.
Right.
We think that conservation covenants could be very useful to deliver some of those, let's say, credit scheme pilots. We also have nutrient neutrality, where we think that conservation covenants would have the capability of delivering agreements which are sufficiently long to address the issues from nutrient pollution. And we also think that we have potential to extend some of our national nature reserves using conservation covenants as well. So there's lots of various areas where we think conservation covenants could be very useful in England. And my understanding is that other organizations have different views and they will probably use them in different circumstances.
Okay, so let's compare that to what is happening in France then also, because this is another country where you do have a legal basis, you have a political, let's say, mandate to use that tool. It's explicit in the French biodiversity law. But maybe you're a few years ahead of England in that regard, that you have already started using the tool. What's the situation there?
Well, thank you very much, Tilman. Yes, we are in the midst of implementation in France. So as Carolina mentioned, the conservative easement is based on a 2016 law. And maybe to start with, I'd like to introduce some other figures, because there has been a question in the chat, and Carolina shared with you figures that comes from my network, FCEN, that is currently signing conservative easements. But French law as regard to easement holder is very broad, as it can be either a public authority or a private organization working in the field of environment. And if we do not have a comprehensive inquiry as to how many easements have been signed so far in France, I still have figures that can give you a hint. So for example, there was a 2021 parliamentary report aiming at inquiring the use of conservative easement. That report was based on an inquiry led by the Ministry of Environment, which at the time was stating that at the end of 2019, there were about 20 easements signed in France. And right now, the number is not official, but the Ministry of Environment is working on a tracking tool. And what I've heard is that in the last 12 months, there is about 90 up to 100 conservative easements that have been signed. So what it shows is that there is a clear increase in the use of that tool in France, even though this could be even wider if we compare, for instance, the number with those presented in the United States by Carolina. So what we are doing right now is working on lifting up barriers so as to further implement that tool. And if you don't mind, I'd like to share one of the barriers we are meeting right now, and we are working on lifting. That barrier is essentially linked with the lack of knowledge in the tool and the cultural change for us that conservative easement represent. Lack of knowledge, I'm talking about essentially a private law culture, especially for easement holder, because so far in France, conservative easement, it's a real paradigm shift in the way we used to legally protect the environment. In France, our legal framework was originally based mainly on public law, which means a top-down approach. We state our bodies of states that would define the territory to be protected and the regulation applying within that territory. And all those regulations, they are controlled by public officers, civil servants, and enforced before a public law judge. Whereas with conservative easement, it's the opposite. It's a bottom-up approach with private actors, private legal professionals, and enforced by a private judge. And enforcement is paramount if we want to have proper conservative easement assigned. And so far, the traditional actors intervening in the field of environment, they have a public law culture, but they are building that private law culture, and they are getting to learn how to use the easement, which is what we are doing right now. We are offering training course. We communicate on that tool, and what we've done, which was, I believe, really efficient, is that we issued a blueprint, a contract to be adapted to any situation by any organization, and we transferred that contract to the all the organizations that could be potential easement holder, but also to civil servant who are in charge of what we call notaries in France, a bit the equivalent of solicitors, who are in charge of registering those conservative easement in the real estate French files. And so far it's working, but it's a work in progress.
All right, that's very interesting to know, because you already hinted at the difference between having a legal framework and then having the people who are supposed to use it, know about it and take it up and have some guidance on it. So I find that distinction very important, as it's something that Carolina highlighted as well.
Yes.
Let's compare that to the Flemish situation, Tom, where excuse me if I'm getting this wrong, but you have a similar legal basis. It's not as explicit as in the French Biodiversity Act, but you are using similar tools for the long-term protection of private property. How is the uptake there? Do notaries know about it? Is it a routine, or is it still rather exotic?
So thank you, Tilman. We have a relatively unique and slightly different system in Flanders in place, where actually the easement is connected to a subsidy system, which comes in place when you draw nature management plans for the protection of a certain area. And when you aim for the highest ambition in Flanders, there is an easement embedded on that land. So with Natuurpunt, we within our organization ourselves, we always aim for nature management plans under the highest ambition. So there's always an easement on the land that we buy, but we also cooperate with private landowners. That's what I also did during the LIFE ENPLC project. Usually, the main actors there, as in private landowners, are actually owners that are next to nature reserve that we, as Natuurpunt, already own, and we start negotiations with them to enlarge the area. In many cases, these types of private landowners are nobility families or larger estate owners. But for LIFE ENPLC, we also case studied a very different type of private landowners, and we managed actually to set an easement with farmers in Flanders, which is very unique, and was a real struggle in terms of a long way, negotiating way to get there. But now there will be nature reserve. There is a nature reserve where 3/4 of the area is managed by farmers under the highest ambition. So there is an easement on that land that it will be forever nature.
Well, that's quite a breakthrough, I think, or an interesting case. If that gets wider uptake and recognition, I think it has a lot of potential as a tool.
Indeed.
So, yeah, you have the financial incentives linked to the implementation of such schemes. So that's, I think, an important component that we can talk about a little more, and also compare it to what's happening in France and England. But let's keep on going on our little European tour here to Catarina, who, as I said, is originally from Portugal. She knows a lot about that, but she's also studied the legal regimes in Italy, Poland, and Romania when it comes to the potential use of easements. So Catarina, you can pick the country you want to start with and give us a little insight of what's the potential and the state of play of easements in these countries.
Okay, thank you so much, Tillman. Hello, everyone. I just take the advantage to salute you all. So at LifeScape, what we are doing is a two-front project. So we are searching and studying the possibility of conservation easements in many jurisdictions in Europe, and at the same time, we are looking at the existing property law mechanisms that can be used for rewilding or conservation. So at the moment, we have developed work in Portugal, Italy, Romania, Poland, Germany, and England and Scotland. And what we found was there's an appetite for conservation easements and US type instruments in the conservation and rewilding community, but then many times that meets obstacles in the existing legal framework. So what we did was to go back to civil law and property law and see what could we use for the short to medium term, because in countries where conservation easements do not exist, as you were saying, it will take a long time to do the advocacy work with the legislative bodies to convince them that this might be actually a good framework to create. So, for instance, starting in Portugal, we found that there's a property right called surface right, and basically, in a nutshell, you have an area of land which is owned by someone, by Mr. A, for instance, and the person retains the ownership of the land, but he solely retains the naked property, as it is called in Portuguese law. And the surface right, so what you can do on the land, is agreed to a third party. And there's a minimum that the agreement must have, but then you can agree anything because it's a private law tool. So the will of the parties are to be respected. And the good thing is that not only the surface right can last for perpetuity, which is very hard, at least in civil law countries, and also if you register this in the land register, it's enforceable against a third party. So if the owner of the land dies and the heirs inherit the land and want to do something, they can't, because the land is assigned to a surface right agreement, which may have rewilding or conservation purposes. So that's a really strong existing tool that can be used, and we are set to test it. It's never been tested for rewilding or conservation purposes, and we feel we will find some resistance from the public entities on that. But I mean, you need to do this. You need to do this work. You need to break away and be the first to try. So we are doing that. Also, there's in Italy there's a similar tool, and it's quite recent. It's called destination deed, where the owner of the land assigns a destination for the land, which can be conservation or rewilding, and that is also registered in the land register, and it runs with the land. It has a time limit, and the main obstacle, it has never been tested for rewilding. So it's another venue. In Romania and Poland, things are a little more complicated. Because, for instance, in Poland, you have a strong presence of public authorities over the ownership of land. So if we are talking about agricultural land, there's these in 2016, there was a reform that if you own agricultural land and you want to sell it, you need to sell it first to a public entity, and it is reserved for 5 years. And also then you can do more of a private law business type of thing. So there are other obstacles that make more difficult to private law tools to go in and act. And this goes also to conservation easements as well. So although there's interest from land managers and the conservation community and rewilding community, there's a lot of legal hurdles in terms of the interference of public entities on these matters. Also to add on what Graham was saying, LifeScape developed these private law legal mechanisms that involves the leasehold and freehold mechanisms, and we are testing it at the moment. We are talking with a lot of landowners that can have huge potential on assigning land for perpetuity for rewilding as well. So it's another instrument that we are testing in England and Scotland at the moment. But it's in its early days, so we will need to wait and see what happens, just as the conservation covenants.
All right, great, Katarina. I mean, I find these, let's say, more creative approaches of using existing property law for conservation purpose so fascinating, because that's the first step into more regulated, codified new way of handling things. But it's it brings with it a shift in thinking about the types of partnerships that are necessary to do that, and that has come up. Renaud mentioned that, Carolina has mentioned that, and so that would be interesting to hear how, when you start testing surface rights, possibilities under Portuguese law, if that helps you establish these kind of new cooperative ways of doing conservation hand in hand with private landowners. Same in Italy. I assume that if you put a destination deed on a property, it will also be somehow be regulated or enforced or overseen by a third party. So it's not just a self obligation, so to speak, but someone else has to gets an enforceable title, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, let's move to Johanna. Katharina very kindly left out Germany, although she also worked in Germany, because Johanna is our first and foremost legal expert on, let's say, the use of easement property law for conservation purposes in Germany. And I have to make a little disclaimer here. I've also implemented conservation easement or easement with conservation purposes on behalf of NABU in Germany. So I'm a bit biased here. So even more so, I'm really interested in how you see the state of play in Germany, legal possibilities and challenges. Johanna, can you give us a bit of insights from your research work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tilman. I'm doing research on estimated property law instruments in Germany that can be used in a way very similar to conservation easements in the US. So we do not have specific conservation easement instruments here, but we do have a regular toolbox of easements and also real burdens in Germany that we can use to a certain degree as conservation easements. And the two I mostly focus on here are the so-called restricted personal easement and the real burden, which are both very special and unique in a way, because Carolina earlier said something about regular hurdles that there can be in most countries when it comes to using existing property law instruments, those being that you can only impose negative obligations, that is, obligations to not do something, and not positive obligations, meaning obligations to do something. And the second being that you mostly need a second piece of property that benefits from the easement. And here, well, we have some special easement or property law instruments in German law, because the restricted personal easement is an easement that actually does not need a second piece of property that benefits from the easement and can be used to impose negative obligations. And the real burden, on the other hand, can be used to impose positive obligations, again, without the requirement of a second piece of property. So what you can do in German law is basically combine the two of them if you want to impose both negative and positive obligations for conservation purposes. And this, as far as I know, has already been done quite a lot, or at least sometimes. It has been done, especially when it comes to compensation measures. So there was a state actor involved. You wanted to construct something on a piece of land, and the state ordered you to take some compensation measures. And in that context, you can use conservation easements or those instruments in German law. And sometimes even conservation organizations or private individuals used them for conservation purposes. But so far, at least I think it's not really been often used in Germany. At least there's a lot more potential of it being used. And this is probably due to two facts. The first one being that most people simply don't know about it, because we just do not have an instrument that says conservation easement or conservation burden covenant. So most people don't think about easements or real burdens when they think about protecting land for conservation purposes. So they just don't know about it. And the second is that, well, you can use those instruments for conservation purposes, but really drafting those conservation easements or conservation real burdens isn't that easy, because there are some details that are, for example, different from the US conservation easement. There are problems when it comes to restrictions on hunting. There are differences when it comes to the assignability of a restricted personal easement. And this is something where you really need at least to start with some legal advice. You can't just do that on your own, because even most lawyers don't really know how to use those instruments for conservation purposes. And I think those are the things that we have to work on in Germany in the coming years.
Right. I mean, I can totally support what you just said, Johanna, from personal experience. Anecdote. Notaries don't really know what you're talking about when you ask them to use the restricted personal servitude, the easement for conservation purposes. But then I found they go along with what you propose them. You just send them a draft text, and they'll be happy to put that in the land registry. If that is the best option, you know, I don't know, but yeah, that's the beauty of just trying it out. You will find out later what works and not. So we've heard so many important aspects now of what we need to have in place in order to make this work and also to upscale it. Maybe we can tie it a bit to where you think the biggest potential lies. Let's say from a political perspective, why do we bother with all this? It's a complicated matter, and I've been very cavalier with regard to the terminology, and Katharina and Johanna, I saw you cringe probably internally when I interchangeably speak of servitudes, easements, covenants as if they were the same. You know better than anyone that they're not. But why are we trying this? What is the potential of easements? Where could it be used? Graham has already mentioned the net biodiversity gain, policies in England, offsetting compensation, crediting schemes, carbon credits, biodiversity credits. Where do you see it's the use of this tool? Who wants to start with that question first? If no one raises his finger or her, that will sign someone.
Tell I'm quite happy to start on that. I think the opportunity lies in any situation where you're wanting long-term conservation, because we don't have the tools at the moment. There was some discussion about other tools that were available. We do have other tools in England, and people at the moment seem to be coming to us saying they think, and all they can do at the moment is say they think, but they think that conservation covenants will be more robust. So if it's a choice between two, the conservation covenant, because it's been specifically designed for conservation, which can last up to in perpetuity, they see that as being the more robust mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So any long-term rewilding, I think definitely. When we're thinking about other environmental conservation measures in terms of targets, conservation covenants would fit with that. And then certain schemes where they want to get more long-term. So nutrient neutrality, that's looking sort of up to about 100 odd years. Credit scheme is 30 years. So anything where there's a risk where a change of ownership would lose the benefits or could lose the benefits.
Right. I know from my practical experience as a conservationist that these kind of tools are sometimes regarded as the second best choice, the best choice being land purchase. So conservation NGOs rather, if they get the choice, they'd rather own the land outright rather than put an easement on it. Tom, Renaud, is that true for your context as well? Can you second that? And if that's the case, that easements are still regarded as second best, what are the advantages of easements with regard to land purchase? Why could it be even better sometimes to assign an easement rather than buy the land?
Oh, go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
I can confirm that at least within Natuurpunt, we try to own as much as land as possible. But regarding the second part of the question, I think if there is no option in ownership, that an easement can no, that's not what I wanted to go. I think that at the moment you own land, you have the certainty as an NGO, while an easement, it's still something which was written in a law, can still be fight or bring up to court. And that's the reason that at least within our NGO, we continue to prefer to own land. Of course, we do work together with a lot of private landowners, not a lot, but a few. But the majority of our managed land is owned land because of that risk that everything which is basically written in law can be discussed in front of a judge.
Okay.
That's it.
Renaud, you want to add to that?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I believe you've mentioned different kind of tools that can be used to protect environment. And ideally, in terms of managing lands and trying to protect biodiversity, what you have is a different range of tools that can be applied to different specific situations. Obviously, there is always an issue of resources once it comes to protecting environment. The best tool would be obviously to buy and to become an owner. That's the best way to protect a specific areas. But what you have with conservative easement is another tool that adds flexibility to cover other kind of areas that you would not target primarily, but that still are of interest according to the context. For instance, maybe biodiversity is not that high, but it's big areas in places where there is a lot of pressure. Or you can also use them as a tool to complete already existing layers of protections. For instance, Grim was talking earlier about extending already existing protections with the use of conservative easements. So I think it gives you flexibility, and that flexibility is very precious because it's another layer that participates in adapting the way we can protect biodiversity everywhere. Sorry.
All right, so there's a certain support of the sentiment that land purchase is a good option, but there may be other contexts and situations where easements have an advantage over that. I assume, you know, let's say the financial dimension of land purchase also puts a certain limit to the use of that tool. Remy, I see you have your hand raised, please.
I was just going to add one thing, and I don't think anyone's mentioned this yet, but if you use a conservation covenant or a conservation easement, you actually engage a bottom-up approach, whereas something like land purchase is very much, you're completely in control. It's much more sort of top-down. And I think there is a role for that sort of encouraging a bottom-up approach and getting more stakeholders involved in sort of conservation management.
Yeah, it brings us back to this collaborative approach to conservation and empowerment of landowners and local communities in this setting. But I guess just buying the land outright cannot deliver in this sense. Katharina, please.
Yeah, I was just adding that because the simple ownership does not guarantee you that the land will run with a conservation or rewilding purpose, because when the owner ceases to exist, even if the owner dies or if the land is owned by by an entity, if the entity is dissolved, if there's not a legal guarantee that the use of that land is for conservation at any type of legal instrument, the next owner, being an heir, being the purchaser, can simply just undo all the work that has been done. So although it's easier to just buy land and do whatever you want on your land, it's not an absolute right, and it has its own limitations. So I think like a mix of ownership with a legal guarantee that conservation and rewilding runs with the land and not with the owner would be the ideal.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect. You're building a fabric of mutual obligations and commitments, so to speak. Tom, if it's a short comment, let's add it to it. Otherwise, I would like to pick up a few questions from the audience and take the chance to
It's a very short one. I just want to say that I totally agree with Katharina, and might want to note that for our organization, our NGO, every land we own from within the NGO has an easement on it. So even if the NGO at some point will be gone, the easement is there in place.
All right, good. So I'll try to combine a few questions from the audience that are linked to the financial incentives or financial considerations of easement. The first one is about the expenses of placing an easement on a property, the due diligence that has to be done, legal advice, and so forth. So the transactional costs, let's call them. Renaud, you may have experience with that. How do nature conservancies in France deal with this? Who has to bear these costs when you sign an ORE?
Well, we have two main kind of conservative easements. There are the voluntary ones and the one used in a compensation mechanism.
Yeah.
In terms of compensation, it's fairly easy. It's a project holder that has the administrative obligation to compensate, who is going to finance. So I'll set that part aside and focus on the voluntary conservative easements. In that case, that will depend on who is at the initiative, for instance. Sometimes it's owners who are willing to protect what they have in a testimonial approach, I would say. Sometimes it's also the easement holder that, as I mentioned earlier, has a strategy in order to protect biodiversity that includes targeting some specific species that you want to protect. And the conservative easement enters in that strategy. And when it's at the heart of your strategy, then in that case, the easement holder may have an incentive to bear the cost. What we have right now is the cost of a notary in order to sign an easement is between 500 up to 2,000 euros. And that price may be shared by the two parties or bear by only one party according to the context. And then as regard to the property loss of value, obviously, because there is one, we are trying to compensate the owner with tax incentives, which are so far insufficient to cover the property loss of value. And we are trying to push forward to secure more tax incentives in that regard.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment you're making there. There can be a reduction of property value due to the easement, which may be reflected in the tax that is due, the property tax or the inheritance tax, real estate tax linked to the property. But you're saying this incentive does not suffice or does not compensate for the transactional costs incurred or the reduction of commercial value of the property. Correct?
No, I mean, yes, you're correct. There is a property loss of value, an obvious one, since you have specific obligations that will follow your property up to 99 years in France. And that property loss of value, we are trying to compensate it with specific tax exemptions that could apply to the owner. But so far, that would be something to push. A tax exemption that is linked with the quantity of the property loss of value. And you are very right. That would be an interesting thing to set up in France. But so far, we only have two tax exemption tools, one of which deals with the recording fees that you have once you register the conservative easement. And the other is just optional, and it's based on a non-built property tax that is decided upon by municipalities. And that's the only two tax exemption existing. And my point was that those exemptions are not sufficient enough right now if you want to cover the property loss of value. Hence, we are trying to push for more tax exemption, which was what we did 2 weeks ago in financial law in France. But so far, the government is not willing to do so in France. But the door remains open since they say that based on an extensive inquiry, we might go further on tax exemptions, which is what we will be working on in the coming months.
Okay. So there's a question in the Q&A asking about whether payments from the Common Agricultural Policy, so the EU farming program, let's say, could be used. Those are annual payments to land users, farmers mostly, to compensate them for the loss of commercial value that properties incur. Katharina, would you like to comment on that? Is that a viable option to incentivize the use of easements?
Yes, actually it is. So the new CAP has some mechanisms that incentivizes farmers and landowners to actually dedicate part of their land to conservation and restoration of biodiversity. Also, when the new, this is an EU level, when the nature restoration law is approved and enters in force, they actually work together for this goal as well. So the nature restoration law can be a good boost to incentivize private landowners to acquire land, and also to member states to facilitate the acquisition of land for conservation, given the overall obligation of the law, which is to have an obligation of continuous improvement and non-deterioration, and all the targets it set, although not as ambitious as initially thought, but still something. So you can use the mechanisms from CAP to be compensated for dedicating part of your land to conservation and restoration of biodiversity. So yes, there are venues to work within the new CAP. Plus, when the nature restoration law comes into force, those venues will be reinforced.
Okay. Well, with an eye to the time, we are 10 minutes over the announced hour that this webinar should take. I'd like to wrap up with one last question, and I'll just do a rapid fire round. Everyone can give it a shot. What do you think is the most important thing that needs to happen now to upscale the use of easements in Europe? Is it the legal framework? Is it the financial incentives? Is it the standards and, let's say, templates and so forth? Is it building the community, the networking, the knowledge exchange? What's the most important thing we need to do next? And this includes also Carolina.
I can go have a first go. I would say that most important at the moment, it's act on a two-way street. So is education, to educate what these instruments are, what are the benefits, how do they work, and so on. Because as Rino was saying, and I think it's most of us that work in this field are aware of, that even lawyers don't know about it. So there's a lot of work to do in educating everyone, and even ourselves in studying more about the potential of these mechanisms. And the second way would be, I would say, to have an agreed standard, general principles of conservation easements that could be applicable in all jurisdictions. So there will be tweaks and slight differences between in each jurisdiction, but have a standardized understanding of what these instruments are and how can they be applied. I think that could be the short-term work to do.
Sounds great. Education and harmonization, it's called. Carolina.
So I agree with Katharina fully. And maybe to add is that I think doing the work and doing the implementations is also really important right now, so we can gain experience. Johanna mentioned it as well. You need to try it out if it works. So yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I can go next, Tillman. So as being here as the one who is implementing them in Flanders, and since we already have sort of conservation easement here, I think when it's in place, one of the main things to tackle are the financial incentives, because that's what we experienced as specifically when working and negotiating with these farmers that I mentioned before. That's really the hardest part.
Okay. I see that Jim has rejoined us, so that also means that we're coming to the end of this webinar. I want to thank all of you very much for your time. Thank you to all the listeners for your interest and curiosity, for the good questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all of them. Please feel free to send us your questions even after this webinar, and we'll make sure that they reach the most appropriate expert who could answer them. You can send those either to the ILCN or to info@eurosite.org. And last but not least, I'd love you to give us a rating, give us a bit of feedback on how this webinar went. You should find the link to that survey, an online survey, in the chat, or you can just use your smartphone if you're younger than me and take the QR code from the screen. Please spend a minute to let us know how we can become better at providing these kind of events for you.
Gentlemen, I would love to just add a word at the end.
Please do.
To thank all of the panelists for your wonderful contributions. It is very heartening to see that our colleagues in Europe and all over the world are working on advancing private land conservation. You all are doing great work in your respective jurisdictions, and all I can say is please keep it up.
I can promise we will, Jim. Thank you. And with that, thanks so much for listening, tuning in, and hope to see you at the next webinar.